The witch's prisoner. The valley of Aurendell had always been a place of quiet beauty. Rolling meadows kissed by sunlight stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with quaint cottages built from stone and timber. A river, as clear as the morning sky, wound lazily through the land, its gentle murmurs lulling the villagers into peaceful slumber. But in recent years, peace had become a distant memory, eroded by the midnight tolling of a bell whose sound carried despair on its winds. It began as a whisper, a faint, sorrowful chime from the mountains. At first, the villagers thought it a trick of the wind, perhaps the call of some distant bird. But the sound grew louder with each passing night, its rhythm measured, deliberate, and oppressive. When the bell tolled, it was as if the very air froze, and with it, the hearts of those who listened. Crops withered, livestock sickened, and strange shadows began to creep through the village at dusk. The elders knew the source of the sound. They had grown up hearing whispers of the cursed prince imprisoned at the peak of Mount Drevrin. It was said that long ago, the witch Tharida, jealous and scorned, had bound him to a magical bell forged from her dark will. With every toll, the prince's torment fueled the witch's growing power, spreading her malice far and wide. No one who ventured into her domain ever returned, and over time, the villagers learned to stay away from the mountain and the darkness it promised. But the tolling was no longer something they could ignore. It resonated through their dreams, fraying nerves and breaking spirits. Desperate, the village gathered in the square beneath the gnarled oak that had stood for centuries. Torches flickered in the cold wind as worried faces turned to one another for answers, for hope. But hope was scarce. One among them, however, stood apart. Toren, the blacksmith, broad-shouldered and silent, watched the gathering from the edge of the crowd. He was a man of few words, known more for his deeds than his speech. His hands were calloused from years of shaping metal into tools and weapons, his eyes steady and sharp, like the steel he forged. "The witch's curse won't break itself," a voice from the crowd murmured. But who among us could hope to survive the mountain? The villagers fell silent, the weight of the question hanging heavy in the air. It was then that Toren stepped forward, his shadow tall against the flickering light. He raised his hand, quieting the murmurs. "I will go," he said simply. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and the village elder, a stooped man named Jorik, stepped forward, his face etched with worry. "Toren, you don't know what you're facing. The mountain is alive with her magic. Men stronger than you have tried and failed." Toren met the elder's gaze. "Strength isn't always measured by size, Elder Jorik. The witch's magic may be powerful, but it is born of fear and cruelty. It can be broken." The elder hesitated, but in Toren's voice, he heard the unyielding resolve of a man who had already decided his path. With a reluctant nod, Jorik motioned for the village priest to step forward. The priest offered Toren a small brass lantern engraved with ancient symbols. This lantern was blessed in the name of the old light, the priest explained. Its flame will not falter, no matter the darkness you face. Let it guide you. Toren accepted the lantern with a solemn bow. The villagers watched as he prepared for his journey, donning a thick leather coat and strapping a sword of his own, making to his side. He carried no shield, for he believed in swift action over defense. As the crowd parted to let him pass, mothers clutched their children, and men murmured prayers under their breath. "Toren," the elder called, his voice heavy with warning. The witch's bell is not just a sound, it's a curse that seeps into the mind. Steel yourself against it, or you will fall as others have. Toren nodded once, his jaw set. If the bell can break minds, it can be silenced. With those words, he turned toward the mountain, its jagged peaks shrouded in mist and shadow. The bell's mournful toll echoed faintly in the distance, as if mocking his resolve. The villagers watched until his silhouette vanished into the trees. The flickering light of the lantern, the last trace of him. And so the blacksmith began his journey, carrying the weight of the village's hopes and the haunting toll of the bell into the unknown. The path to Mount Drevrin was steep and treacherous, winding through dense undergrowth and uneven terrain. With each step, the shadow of the mountain loomed larger, blotting out the moonlight and plunging Toren into an uneasy darkness. The only light came from the priest's brass lantern, its steady flame casting long flickering shadows against the gnarled trees. The tolling of the bell, distant but unrelenting, pulled at his senses, each chime a haunting reminder of the task ahead. As he climbed, memories of the villagers lingered in his mind, the fear etched into their faces, the children's wide, tearful eyes. Toren had made his choice not out of glory or ambition, but because he could not bear to see his home consumed by despair. The bell had to be silenced, no matter the cost. The journey was lonely, but Toren's resolve was his companion. He thought back to the oath he had made before leaving the village. Kneeling before the oak in the square, he had whispered words meant only for himself. "I will be their strength when they have none. I will be their hope when all else fails." These words now echoed in his mind, fortifying him against the biting cold and the creeping unease that grew with each step. The air grew heavier as he entered the forest at the base of the mountain, its trees ancient and twisted as if shaped by some dark force. The forest floor was a carpet of damp moss, dotted with mushrooms that glowed faintly in the dark. The tolling of the bell seemed louder here, resonating in the very ground beneath his feet. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, invasive and oppressive, that pressed against his thoughts. He paused, his hand instinctively tightening on the hilt of his sword. The forest was alive with strange sounds, the crackling of branches, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and faint laughter that sent shivers down his spine. His lantern flickered, the flame wavering as if disturbed by unseen breath. Then the whispers grew clearer, forming words. "Turn back, blacksmith. You have no place here." Toren straightened, his voice steady as he spoke aloud. "I won't be stopped by shadows." As if in response, the forest shifted. The path ahead twisted unnaturally, roots bursting from the ground to block his way. Toren gritted his teeth and drew his sword, its edge gleaming in the lantern's light. With careful precision, he hacked at the roots, clearing a path forward. The forest resisted, its branches clawing at him like grasping fingers. But Toren pressed on, his movements sure and unyielding. Hours passed, though time seemed meaningless in the forest's suffocating darkness. As he ventured deeper, the tolling of the bell grew sharper, each note cutting through the air like a blade. Toren began to feel its effects, an ache in his chest, a heaviness in his limbs, and a voice in the back of his mind that whispered his deepest fears. He saw flashes of faces in the shadows, his parents long gone, their expressions twisted in sorrow. He heard the cries of villagers who had depended on him, their voices filled with accusation. "Why couldn't you save us, Toren? Why did you let us suffer?" For a moment, doubt clawed at him. What if he failed? What if the bell's power was too great? The whispers grew louder, feeding on his hesitation. But then, he tightened his grip on his sword and whispered back, "I didn't come here to listen to lies." The lantern's flame flared brighter, as if responding to his defiance, and the shadows receded. Toren felt a surge of clarity, his resolve hardening like tempered steel. He took a deep breath, shaking off the lingering doubt, and continued forward. Finally, as dawn's faint light began to creep through the treetops, Toren emerged from the forest, his boots crunching against frost-covered rocks. Before him, the mountain's peak loomed closer, shrouded in mist that swirled with unnatural energy. The bell's toll was deafening now, a relentless rhythm that seemed to echo from everywhere at once. Toren paused to catch his breath, gazing up at the jagged summit. He had passed the first trial, but he knew the forest's tricks were just the beginning. The witch's domain was vast, and her power stretched far beyond the trees. Yet he pressed on, his oath and the faint hope of silencing the bell driving him forward. As he began his ascent toward the summit, he couldn't help but wonder, who was the prince trapped within the witch's curse, and what torment must he endure to fuel such a terrible sound? The answer, Toren knew, lay ahead, waiting in the shadows of Mount Drevrin. The enchanted forest had earned its name in blood and whispers, a place where few dared tread and none returned unchanged. As Toren ventured deeper into its shadowy embrace, he felt the forest come alive around him. Not as a welcoming host, but as a predator, watching, waiting for its prey to falter. The trees were ancient, their gnarled roots weaving a tangled web across the ground. Their branches reached out like skeletal hands, clawing at the air above him. The bark of the tree shimmered faintly as though veined with silver, and strange symbols etched into their trunks seemed to shift when he looked away. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, only the oppressive silence punctuated by the tolling of the distant bell. Toren's lantern flickered faintly, its light pushing back the encroaching shadows. He tightened his grip on its handle, his other hand resting on the hilt of his sword. His instincts screamed that he was being watched, but the forest gave no sign of an intruder. Still, Toren moved cautiously, every step deliberate, as he followed the faint, winding trail before him. The first true test came in the form of illusions. As Toren pressed forward, he began to hear voices, soft at first like the murmur of distant streams, but growing louder with every step. They called his name, voices he recognized but couldn't place. His pulse quickened as he heard the familiar timbre of his mother's voice, then his father's, both long dead. They spoke with warmth, coaxing him to turn back. "Toren," the voice of his mother whispered, as sweet as he remembered. "Come home. You don't have to do this." Then his father, gruff but kind. "There's nothing for you here, son. Save yourself." Toren stopped in his tracks, his heart hammering. The voices sounded so real, tugging at the edges of his resolve. He turned his head, and in the dim light of the lantern, he saw them. His parents, standing on the path ahead, their arms open in welcome. "It's not real," he muttered to himself, but the sight of them brought a sharp ache to his chest. He took a shaky step forward, then another, the weight of longing pulling him closer. But as he drew nearer, the lantern's light revealed the truth. The figures shifted, their forms flickering like dying embers. Their faces twisted, no longer warm and familiar, but hollow and grotesque, with empty eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Toren stepped back, his sword flashing in the lantern's light. The illusion dissolved into mist, and the forest around him seemed to sigh in disappointment. "I am not so easily fooled," Toren said aloud, his voice steady despite the lingering ache in his heart. Further into the forest, the path became treacherous, narrowing as jagged roots and thorny vines snaked across his way. The air grew colder, and the tolling of the bell echoed louder, each chime reverberating through his bones. He pushed on, ignoring the whispers that followed him, their tones shifting from pleading to mocking. Eventually, he reached a clearing bathed in an eerie glow. In its center stood a massive wolf-like creature, its fur black as night and its eyes molten gold. The creature regarded Toren with an intelligence that sent a chill down his spine. When it spoke, its voice was deep and resonant, like the tolling of the cursed bell. "You are brave to come this far, blacksmith," the wolf said, its lips curling into something that could almost be a smile. "But courage will not save you. Turn back now, and I will let you live." Toren met the creature's gaze unflinching. "I cannot turn back. The bell must be silenced." The wolf chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Then you will face me in full, like the others." Without warning, the creature lunged, its massive form a blur of shadow and fangs. Toren barely had time to raise his sword, the clash of steel against claw ringing out through the clearing. The fight was brutal, the wolf's strength and speed testing every ounce of Toren's skill and resolve. But the blacksmith was no stranger to battles, and his blade, crafted with care and purpose, found its mark. With a final defiant howl, the wolf collapsed, its body dissolving into ash. As the clearing grew quiet, Toren stood over the remains, his chest heaving. The lantern's light burned brighter, illuminating the path ahead. The forest seemed to relent after the battle, its oppressive energy lifting slightly. Toren took a moment to catch his breath, his hand steady despite the strain of the fight. He had passed another trial, but the tolling of the bell reminded him that his journey was far from over. As he pressed on toward the mountain's summit, the path became steeper and the air colder. The forest gave way to rocky terrain, but the shadows of the enchanted forest lingered in his mind. The witch's domain had tested him, but Toren knew the worst was yet to come. With the cursed bell drawing him closer, Toren steeled himself for the battles ahead. He had sworn to silence the toll, and no force, man, beast, or magic, would stop him. The path to the summit of Mount Drevrin grew narrower, jagged stones cutting into Toren's boots as he climbed. The air was thinner here, each breath sharp and cold, but it was not the altitude that weighed on him. The tolling of the bell had grown deafening, reverberating through the mountain itself. Each chime felt like a blow against his chest, as if the sound sought to crush the resolve from his very soul. Finally, the mist parted, revealing the witch's lair, a fortress of crumbling stone perched precariously on the mountain's peak. Black ivy snaked along its walls, pulsing faintly as though it were alive. Toren hesitated for the first time, his breath clouding in the frigid air. He tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword, the lantern's light flickering uncertainly beside him. The silence between the bell's tolls was filled with a palpable tension, the kind that settles before a storm. Summoning his courage, Toren stepped forward, pushing the massive iron doors open with a groan that echoed into the darkness beyond. Inside, the lair was a twisted mockery of grandeur. Stained glass windows depicted scenes of suffering, their colours distorted by the eerie glow of the cursed bell that stood at the chamber's centre. It was enormous, carved from black obsidian and bound with runes that seemed to writhe as Toren approached. Chains as thick as a man's arm extended from the bell to the walls, anchoring it in place. And there, bound to the base of the bell, was the prince. He was gaunt, his skin pale as moonlight, and his hair hung in dark, matted strands around his face. His wrists and ankles were shackled to the bell, the chains biting into his flesh. Yet his eyes, though sunken and tired, glowed with an otherworldly light, a faint flicker of life refusing to be extinguished. "You've come," the prince said, his voice hoarse but steady. There was no surprise in his tone, only a quiet acceptance. "Another fool sent to break the curse?" Toren knelt beside him, inspecting the chains. They were inscribed with the same runes as the bell, pulsating with malevolent energy. "I'm not here to fail," Toren said, meeting the prince's gaze. "Tell me what I must do." The prince let out a hollow laugh, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "It's not so simple. The witch bound my soul to this bell. Every toll feeds her power, spreading her curse further into the world. To destroy the bell is to destroy me. Do you understand?" Toren hesitated, the weight of the prince's words settling over him. He had prepared himself for danger, for trials. But this was different. He looked at the prince, a man whose life had been stolen, whose suffering had become a weapon against the innocent. "I swore an oath to free my people," Toren said firmly. "If that means ending the curse, no matter the cost, then so be it." The prince's expression softened, his defiance giving way to a quiet gratitude. "I have prayed for release," he whispered. "But beware. The witch will not let you take her power without a fight." As if summoned by his words, the air in the chamber shifted. The shadows along the walls coiled and writhed, converging into a single terrible form. The witch Tharida emerged, her beauty sharp and cruel like the edge of a blade. Her eyes burned with a venomous green light, and her voice dripped with mockery. "So another mortal seeks to play hero," she said, her words echoing through the chamber. "Did the last screams of my forest not teach you enough? Or do you believe your feeble steel can challenge my will?" Toren rose to his feet, his sword flashing in the lantern's light. "Your curse has plagued the innocent for too long. It ends here." Tharida laughed, a sound that was both beautiful and terrible. "Brave words, blacksmith. Let me show you the price of defiance." She raised her hand, and the shadows surged forward, taking the shapes of serpents and clawed beasts. The ground trembled as the creatures lunged at Toren, their teeth snapping inches from his throat. But Toren's resolve was unshaken. He fought with precision, his blade cutting through the shadowy forms, each strike a testament to his skill and determination. Yet Tharida, was no mere opponent. She wielded the bell's power, each toll sending waves of energy that threatened to knock Toren from his feet. He gritted his teeth, pushing through the pain, his eyes fixed on the bell and the prince. Finally, with a roar of defiance, Toren broke through the last of the shadows, his sword raised high. Tharida's laughter faltered, her form flickering as he approached the bell. "You'll destroy him," she screamed. "The prince's life is bound to the bell. Strike it and he dies." Toren hesitated for only a heartbeat, the prince's calm gaze meeting his own. "Do it," the prince said, his voice firm. "End this." With a cry, Toren brought his sword down on the bell. The obsidian cracked, a deafening roar filling the chamber as the witch screamed in fury. The chains shattered, and the prince's body glowed with a blinding light. As the bell crumbled, the witch's form dissolved into mist, her power undone. The prince smiled faintly, his body fading into light. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice a sigh on the wind. The chamber fell silent, the tolling of the bell forever silenced. Toren stood alone, the remnants of the prince and the curse scattered like ash around him. Silence filled the ruined chamber. For the first time in years, there was no bell, no ominous toll to pierce the night. The cursed sound that had haunted the valley and enslaved the prince was gone, leaving only the faint crackle of dissipating energy in its place. Toren stood amidst the crumbled remnants of the bell, his chest heaving and his sword still in his hand. The prince's body had vanished, his final smile imprinted on Toren's mind. He had been a man bound not by chains alone, but by the weight of unimaginable torment, enduring for the sake of others. His release was a victory, but it did not feel like triumph. It felt like the quiet, inevitable end of a storm, leaving behind a hollow calm. Toren dropped to one knee, resting his sword against the ground. The tolling's absence was almost disorienting, the silence pressing against his ears like a physical force. He glanced at the shattered pieces of the bell. They lay scattered like shards of obsidian glass, their surfaces dull and lifeless. The runes that had once pulsed with dark energy were now nothing more than faint etchings, powerless and inert. For a moment, Toren allowed himself to breathe, his body trembling from exhaustion. The witch's shadows, the prince's chains, the bell's relentless toll, all had tested him in ways he had never imagined. Yet he had prevailed. He had kept his oath. The air in the chamber began to change. The oppressive darkness that had clung to every surface started to lift, replaced by a soft golden glow. The cursed ivy that twisted along the walls withered and crumbled to dust, and faint rays of sunlight began to filter through the cracked stained glass windows. The fortress, once a monument to Tharida's malice, seemed to sigh as it was freed from her grip. Toren rose to his feet, the lantern's flame flickering steadily beside him. He turned toward the massive iron doors, the path out of the lair beckoning him forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from fatigue, but from the weight of all that had transpired. He had set out to silence the bell and protect his people, and he had succeeded, but at the cost of an innocent life. As he exited the fortress and stepped onto the mountain's peak, Toren paused to take in the sight before him. The valley stretched far below, bathed in the soft light of dawn. The cursed shadows that had once spread from the mountain were gone, replaced by a tranquil stillness. The forest that had tested him so fiercely no longer looked menacing. Its twisted trees stood straighter, their leaves glinting with dew in the morning sun. Toren closed his eyes and let the cool mountain air wash over him. The bell's final toll had been a song of liberation, a breaking of chains that echoed not only through the valley, but through his very soul. He thought of the prince, of his courage and quiet acceptance, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. The prince's sacrifice had not been in vain. As Toren began his descent, he found the forest welcoming him with a surprising gentleness. The path, though still steep, was clear and unmarred by the illusions and tricks that had plagued him before. The creatures of the forest, birds, foxes, and small deer, peeked out from their hiding places, watching him with curious, unthreatening eyes. Even the air felt lighter, as though the mountain itself had been freed of its burden. The journey back to the village was long, but Toren felt no need to rush. The bell was silenced, and the curse was broken. He carried with him not only the memories of his trials, but also the knowledge that he had fulfilled his oath. He was not the same man who had climbed the mountain with only a lantern and a sword. He was someone who had faced darkness and prevailed, though the scars of the journey would linger. When he finally arrived at the village, the sun was high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the valley. The villagers were gathered in the square, their faces filled with anxious anticipation. As Toren stepped into view, the crowd erupted into cheers and cries of relief. Mothers clutched their children, and men clasped his shoulders, thanking him with tearful gratitude. Elder Jorish approached, his expression one of awe and reverence. "The tolling has stopped," he said softly, his voice trembling. "You've done it, Toren. You've silenced the curse." Toren nodded, though his heart was heavy with the memory of the prince. "It is finished," he said simply. That night, the village celebrated with a feast, though Toren remained quiet, his thoughts lingering on the mountain and the prince's final words. When the festivities ended, he retreated to his forge, the place where he had always found solace. There, by the flickering firelight, he began to work. He melted the fragments of the cursed bell he had brought back, forging them into a single gleaming sword. It would be a reminder, not of the curse, but of the courage it had taken to break it. A monument to the prince who had endured, and to the blacksmith who had kept his oath. And so, the story of the tolling bell and the cursed prince passed into legend. The villagers spoke of it for generations, a tale of sacrifice, courage, and redemption. But for Toren, it was not legend, it was life. And in the quiet moments by his forge, he would sometimes look toward the mountain, remembering the final toll that had set them all free.